I kind of just had my New Year greetings to mix and say a Happy New Year to everybody, and it's lovely to begin a new year together as a family of God. Well, Christmas and New Year have been and gone, and hopefully the worst of the fireworks are finished with, and I know that my little dog Alfie will be very pleased about that, because he does not like fireworks. So what's next then on the agenda? Well, as Mick's already indicated, we are looking forward to the induction service of Alex in a couple of weeks' time. And that's going to be the beginning of an exciting and an amazing time for this church, I'm sure, as Alex and his family joins us. And it's something to rejoice about and pray about and be grateful to God for. But what about normal? What about normal things and our normal lives and everyday lives? Well, at this time of year, traditionally, in normal times, millions of minds would now be turning to a serious subject: planning the summer holiday. But of course, in these uncertain times, things are less predictable, aren't they? But maybe the travel agents won't be quite as busy as they would have been in pre-COVID days. But you know, I grew up in even stranger times than these. The whole world was at war. The war started in September, the Second World War started in September 1939, and I was 3. And holidays just didn't happen in the 6 years following World War II. There was a slogan: "Is your journey really necessary?" And certainly holidays were not deemed necessary nor patriotic at the time. And so, as a child, I didn't have a holiday. But after the war, around 1947, I was 10 or 11. I was about the same age as Tommy. How old are you, Tommy? 11. Well, I was about a little boy like Tommy at that time, and I was taken on a holiday. Amazing. I've never been on a holiday before. And I was taken to a little-known resort called New Brighton. Does anybody know where New Brighton is? It's just across the mouth of the River Mersey at the end of the Wirral Peninsula, and it's a small little resort that not many people have heard of anyway. You had to go to Liverpool and then get on a ferry boat. There were 2. One was called the Royal Iris and the other was the Royal Daffodil. And this boat took you across the river to Birkenhead, and then you got a bus or a train or a tram up to New Brighton. The 2 ferry boats, by the way, as a matter of interest, had been involved in the evacuation of Dunkirk in the fall of France from the 27th of May to the 4th of June, 1940. My dad told me that, so I was interested in that. We were staying in a small boarding house, which you did in those days, nothing posh, of course, but very exciting for a little boy of 11 who'd never been on a holiday. And we were told by the landlady an incredible wartime story, a true wartime story. We slept in a room which had a double bed and a single bed, and in the double bed, in the headboard, the wooden headboard of the double bed, there was a neat round bullet hole. And the landlady told us how it happened. She said around about 1942 there'd been a raid on Liverpool, a bombing raid, and as the German bombers turned around to fly back to Germany, one of them overflew the little seaside resort of New Brighton. And being mean, which was what happened in wartime, they swooped down low and machine gunned the houses. They strafed the houses as they overflew the little town. The landlady and her husband were in bed at the time in this double bed, and a machine gun bullet came crashing through the window drilled a neat hole through the bed head, the headboard of the bed, and buried itself in the wall behind. They were asleep in the bed, and the bullet missed them by inches. Now, to me, a young lad round about Tommy's age, I was fascinated by this, and I was so excited to be able to tell my schoolmates when I got back to school after the holiday what I'd heard about this bullet hole in the bed. You might wonder where all this is going, but this holiday actually made me think of Jesus. Did Jesus have a holiday when he was a little boy? He did, Tommy. Tommy's shaking his head, but he did. When he was about Tommy's age, a bit older actually, he was 12. We're told in Luke's Gospel that he was taken by his earthly mother and father, Joseph and Mary, on a holiday to Jerusalem. And they went there to celebrate the feast of the Passover, which was what Jewish people did when they could in those days. Now remember, this was harder times. They lived in harder times than we're living in now. And they lived in harder times, I would say harder times probably than even I lived through in the Second World War, because there was a Roman occupation of the Middle East at that time, and they lived under the cruel oppression of the Romans. But they were allowed to go to Jerusalem and celebrate this feast. And what they had to do, of course, there was no buses or trains, they had to walk. And there were two routes down from Nazareth down to Jerusalem. One was through Samaria, which was 65 miles, but it was dangerous because Samaria was considered enemy territory. There was a longer route which followed the River Jordan down the Jordan Valley, which was below sea level and very hot. But that was 80 miles, and at the end of that, they followed the river down past the Dead Sea, and then they went up into the hills around Jericho, and then on to Jerusalem. Now, there were lots of robbers and bandits in that area, so the people travelled. They would have travelled in a large group from the large group of people from the north would have gathered together for safety and travelled because there was safety in numbers. The journey took 5 days, so that meant they made camp 4 times, 4 nights camp on the way. They had to carry all their belongings and the supplies and everything they needed for the journey. Maybe they had a donkey. Maybe if they were rich enough, a few families joined together and got a donkey to carry their belongings and supplies. Maybe they had a donkey cart, and a few families put the supplies and belongings in the cart. I don't know. We're not told. But anyway, it would not be an easy journey. But they were on a holiday, and I'm sure they must have been thrilled to bits to go to Jerusalem. And we read how Jesus, the boys, spent a lot of his time whilst they were there. They would be there about a week, and celebrating the feast of the Passover. Jesus loved to go to the temple in Jerusalem and spend time with the wise teachers there and the experts in the law and religious teachers. And he spent most of his time there in the temple talking to these men. We're told this in Luke's Gospel. And they were amazed that of the grasp of Scripture that this young lad had. He was only 12, but he was amazingly well informed about the Old Testament Scriptures. Of course, he wasn't just an ordinary boy, was he? He was God's son. But at that point in time, we're not really sure how aware he was of who he was and what he could come for. We're not told in Scripture. We do know one thing for sure. He did know at that time that God in heaven was his Father. And I'll explain that in a minute. When the feast was over, the group from Nazareth would have gathered together for the return journey. And they would set off together as a group. Probably all the grown-ups would be walking together, and the young people would have their own group, and they would be following. And Mary and Joseph assumed that Jesus was with the young people's group. But in actual fact, he wasn't. There'd been some kind of a mix-up, some kind of a misunderstanding. I don't know what happened or why. We're not told. But Jesus had been left behind in Jerusalem. And they travelled a whole day and they made camp before they realised that the boy Jesus was not with the group. And you can imagine how worried Joseph and Mary must have been, but also how annoyed. And because they had to turn round and have the following day and travel a whole day back to Jerusalem to search for him. And it indicates in the gospel that it took 3 days to find him. When they did find him, he was in the temple, still talking to the teachers of the law and the wise religious men. And understandably, his mother Mary was quite, well, she wasn't well pleased by this. And she said to him, "Do you know how much worry you've given your father and me?" And Jesus made a surprising reply. He looked puzzled. And he said, "Well, why were you worried? Don't you know that I must be about my Father's business?" You see, he knew at that point that God was his Father. And he couldn't understand as a child why they were so worried about him. But anyway, it's understandable how frustrated they must have been. When he was here on earth, he was always subject and obedient to the Father's will and purpose. And here we're in very deep theological territory, aren't we? It's absolutely unexplainable or understandable to our mortal minds, but it's totally true. He wasn't God the Father, he wasn't God the Spirit, but he was indeed God the Son, one part of the Holy Trinity and equal to the other two. And being sinless in his nature, he was also immortal. The only way he could physically die was of his own choice, to lay down his life of his own free will, which he did on the cross. And he also had the power to take it up again, which he did after 3 days, and there was no decomposition of his body. In his life on earth, his emotions and feelings were all subject to all the rigors and pain that we know: thirst, hunger, happiness, sadness. He knew all these things. He felt them just as we feel them, yet he was sinless in his nature, and perfectly sinless and perfectly obedient to the will of his Father. But we do read that when they returned to Nazareth after the Jerusalem incident, that he grew in grace and wisdom. Now there's a thought for you. I don't know the answers. I'm sharing questions with you this morning rather than giving you answers. It says he grew in wisdom and grace. So he had to learn these things. They were things that he had to acquire. It's a mystery. Can you understand what I'm getting at? How did Jesus, the boy, change into the adolescent and then into the mature man who was the Messiah as he began his ministry? We know for sure that the Spirit of God descended on him at his baptism. We're told that. And was this the big turning point in his development? Well, I'll leave you to answer that. Now, I've been a Christian now for over 60 years, and even though I've heard many thousands of sermons, I've never heard anybody clarify or try to clarify these mysteries, and I don't think I ever will, because we just don't know. It's not there. It's one of the things that Scripture leaves out. Jesus, the 12-year-old boy, listening and learning to the teachers in the temple of Jerusalem, and at the same time amazing them by his grasp of Scripture, being subject to Joseph and Mary and honouring them as the commandments demanded that he must do, but then transforming into the miracle worker, the master of all things, the weather, the wind, sickness, death, one who, like God the Father, could do all things, one who had all wisdom and truth, who spoke and preached as no man ever before or since has done, one full of compassion and love, yet one who could, if needed, be very firm and unassailable. These are all things we wish we could understand, but the fact is we can't. Because who can know the mind of God, and who are men to question him? But just to finish, we do know that he lived on earth about 33 years, 32, 33 years, and then he died of his own free will on the cross, and then he rose again. And in doing this, he secured our salvation. We know this. This is something that we know. It's not just a general fact. We know it as a personal truth if we are born-again Christians. And dear friends, this is the most important truth that we need to know. There are many things we don't know, but if we know that, we know the most amazing truth that we ever need to know. And as we step forward into this new year, I hope that is our assurance and blessing. Thank you very much for listening.